Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me on my regular update from what's happening in the Capitol and also what's happening all around the Commonwealth. I got 3 or 4 items I want to touch on first before I turn it over to Laura for questions. First is the tragedy that's taking place down in Buchanan County, where once again this small coalfield county is getting hit with extraordinarily dangerous and devastating floods. Some of you who follow this may recall that a little over a year ago there was a similar flood in Hurley in Buchanan County. As a matter of fact, I remember back 20 plus years ago in my first month or two of being governor, where we had a flood in Buchanan County. So this is an area of the Commonwealth that unfortunately gets hit on a regular basis. This current flood in Buchanan has not hit Hurley, but has hit about 800 other structures in Buchanan County. Not only homes, but businesses have been affected as well. The good news is, as of an hour or so ago, we'd gone from about 40 people who were missing now down to 3. I know search and rescue squads and others are out looking for those missing individuals. I've talked to Governor Youngkin on this issue. I stand ready to do anything and everything I can to make sure once the governor makes a request for federal assistance, that we will back that up. I'm still bitterly disappointed that the previous flood in Hurley didn't receive federal assistance because they felt like the formula didn't hit the appropriate checkpoints. I think there's candidly an inherent bias against smaller communities in our FEMA funding formula. And the unfortunate thing in this circumstances is the damage is much more extensive than the flood a year ago, hitting more than homes. And I'm going to do all I can working with Tim Kaine and Morgan Griffith and all of the other officials to make sure that we get the kind of relief that these families need. So I'm sure more to come on the awful flooding in Buchanan County. Next, I wanted to raise an issue that a little bit of I told you so, but approach, and that is a letter I sent a couple of weeks ago with my vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Marco Rubio, to the Federal Trade Commission, asking them to investigate the security conditions around the website TikTok. Literally hundreds of millions of Americans use TikTok, disproportionately young people. TikTok is a company that is controlled by a Chinese parent, a company named ByteDance. And as I continue to point out, these Chinese tech companies, which by Chinese law, are required to share their information, share their data with the Communist Party in China, is a huge national security threat. Now, a number of years ago, and this is one of the areas where I give President Trump credit, President Trump raised concerns about TikTok. And the management at that point tried to put in place protections so that Americans' data, think about your kids' usage of TikTok, those videos. Many places, TikTok is also obtaining biometric information about their users. Think about your kids potentially giving up that information to this site. We were promised American data would be kept separate. Well, there's now been investigations that show from 2021 into at least late August 2021 to at least January 2022, it appears that Chinese engineers were getting access to that data. So we have asked in a bipartisan fashion on a national security basis that the Federal Trade Commission needs to initiate an investigation into deceptive practices taken place by TikTok and to try to put a series of remedies in place. TikTok ought to get its so-called day in court, but this raises a whole host of concerns that I have about Chinese tech companies' pervasive sucking up of data. It points out again the fact that we still don't have a national data privacy law in this country, which is crazy. And I know I've been asked by not just press but by parents and friends. I would have a great deal of caution about TikTok at this point. I would not have TikTok on any of my devices. I think the idea of this information being sucked out and reposited who knows where in China. Remember, China was the instigators behind the OPM hack a number of years ago that picked up a lot of federal employees' personal data. It was the instigators behind the Equifax hack a few years back, where many of us with that credit rating agency had our hundreds of millions of Americans' personal data obtained. I think the threat remains that China could be sucking out this data from TikTok, literally touching millions and millions of folks. And people say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is, you have your privacy penetrated, and potentially even in a way that you could be threatened or in effect, somebody has some ability to put you in a compromising position. And on top of that, as we move into the world of artificial intelligence, those countries that have the most data will be the most successful. So I'm anxious to hear the FTC's reaction to that issue. Two other items. One is we're still, I think, all reeling from the Dobbs decision at the Supreme Court. I've joined with most of my Democratic colleagues in the Senate to create a law that would be called Freedom to Travel Act. This would make sure that no state could put penalties in place for women who, if they live in a state that dramatically restricts women's health care choices, or in the case of the outrageous law in Texas, where basically people are told to go spy on your neighbors and then report if someone was going to try to get access to reproductive health care choices. We're starting to see laws put up in certain states to almost prevent women from traveling to a state where abortions are still legal. In Virginia, we still have women's health care rights are protected. I don't think if an adjacent state precludes those rights that you should be able to prohibit a woman from traveling to Virginia or traveling to a state where reproductive choices are still safe and legal. My hope is that we could see action on this legislation. Candidly, whether it could get 60 votes in the Senate is a bit of a challenge. I'll be the first to acknowledge, but it's one more reason why I say to folks, elections matter. The Supreme Court's making these decisions because part of the Supreme Court nomination process was a little bit stacked, and judges were not appointed in an appropriate process in the tail days of President Obama's term, and then people were rushed through during President Trump's term, and now we've got this result, and I hope people will remember that when they come to vote this November. Finally, and this is an issue, and I don't know if Mike Gooding's on the line today, that it's just I don't have a great answer, but it's the circumstances that happened at the Hampton VA, where one more time we've now got a report of a Hampton patient that didn't get appropriate care, a Hampton veteran that didn't get appropriate care, where a cancer diagnosis was not put in place, where the protocols didn't fully work. I will point out that most of this happened before the current director of the Hampton VA was in place, but the congressional delegation were leading a letter to the Inspector General to get full visibility on what protocols and standards were missed. I've spent an enormous amount of time, energy, and gotten an awful lot of federal money to help the Hampton VA in terms of making sure veterans can don't have to wait a long time to get their medical appointments. We've worked for years to try to make sure we can build additional VA facilities all across Virginia, but particularly in Hampton Roads, a large new facility on the south side. And while all the evidence to date indicates this is simply one patient, but with that one patient, protocols were not followed. And as somebody who is at that facility on a regular basis, it is. I want to get all my information first, but I'm going to expect answers, and I'm going to expect a better result. We owe our veterans both the ability to get into the VA on a timely basis. They shouldn't have to wait weeks or months to get an appointment. And then when they get the medical services they've earned, we got to make sure those medical services are carried out in a professional and efficient manner. And it just makes me angry. I can say on this kind of television screen that if I have to hear this kind of report after so much time and effort has been made to continue to try to improve the quality of service. I think the vast majority of folks who work at the Hampton VA do so because they care for our veterans, but we've got to get to the bottom of what happened in not only this one particular case, but to make sure there are protocols in place to make sure it never happens again. So with that, I'll turn it over to Laura and be happy to take your questions.
Hi, good morning. I want to remind everyone on the call to please mute your devices if someone is unmuted. Perfect, thank you. As a reminder, that the audio that's distributed will be solid and you'll be able to use it. Our first question will be from Hannah Brandt with Nexstar.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for taking our questions. I appreciate it. Wanted to ask you about an idea that the Biden administration says it's considering about rolling back import tariffs that were put in place during the Trump administration. Do you think that would help with inflation? And are you concerned that would have implications for how we trade on the world stage?
Well, a lot of the import tariffs that were put in place during President Trump's administration were directed at China. And I think our biggest long-term economic, strategic, and technology challenge of the 21st century is China. And when I say China, my beef is with the Communist Party of China, with Xi Jinping's leadership. It is not with the Chinese people. It is not with the Chinese Americans, the Chinese diaspora anywhere in the world. And even under President Trump, I felt that there was misuse of some of these tariffs around steel and aluminum, for example, and how some of those tariffs even affected some of our, it was not just on China, for example, but it was, for example, on countries like Canada. He slapped these tariffs, for example, on Canada under a national security threat. Canada's our largest trading partner. Canada's our closest ally in the world. So I think some of those tariffs were wrong-headed. So I am open to what President Biden is doing on rolling back some of these tariffs. It will cut back on some of the inflationary costs that are driven, frankly, by the nature of a tariff. But it is only a partial solution. One of the things that coming out of COVID that we have to grapple with is the disruption in supply chains around the world. And the truth is, we should not long-term be reliant on particularly Chinese products. Oftentimes, for example, like rare earth minerals, we all want to move to electric vehicles, where China controls most of the materials, like cobalt and others that go into an electric battery. That is a long-term bad solution for America. The idea that a lot of what's called the APIs, the basic chemical components that go into our pharmaceuticals, come from China. We need to secure a domestic, or at least a domestic combined with our allies' supply chain. The truth is, though, that's going to be a little bit disruptive in this balance of how we don't add to inflation in the short term, but at the same time make our supply chain more secure is a I can frankly go into way too much more detail than you want at this point into how we navigate that. And I'll spare you, but in the short term, the idea, and I'd want to see by product line where Biden is talking about cutting back on some of these tariffs, but I am open to that, and I would hope he would engage with Congress on that issue. And I say this again, we've got to bring down inflation, but we also have to bear in mind, I think, the longer-term national security issues as well. So long-term dependence on China products, not good at all. Some immediate relief I'm open to by product line, but we must continue to invest in more secure domestic and friendly country supply chain. And again, I didn't go into this at the outset because Rachel said don't whack them again on this, but that is why I am obsessed about we've got to get this bill done on semiconductor chips. You know, that is an area where China is starting to dominate part of the supply chain, where all of the leading chips in the world literally are not made here in America, but are made in Taiwan, as we see with Russia, Ukraine, and we hear President Xi's aggressive talk about Taiwan. If that chip supply from Taiwan was shut down, you would see an economic, not recession, but potentially depression. And we have been dilly-dallying for a year. We passed the bill a year ago in the Senate. We still haven't gotten it to the president's desk. And in that last year, the rest of the world has woken up, and they are making these investments in their own semiconductor chip manufacturing facilities, not just China, but around the world. And we're going to miss the boat. And the point I made yesterday, I will get to the next question, but it's if we don't do this before we leave in August, and these companies make investments in other nations, and then we come back in October, November, December, and say, hey, we're going to offer you this subsidy as well. Well, a company, once they've made an investment, these are $15 to $20 billion facilities, they can't start simultaneously two of these projects at once. So even if we have plenty of subsidy for Intel or TSMC or Samsung or Micron, where we've got a plant in Virginia already, just the way the companies work on building out their capacity, it could be 2 or 3 years before they'd start a new project in America. So we've got to get this done. I hope actually next week.
Thank you. And I want to remind everyone to please mute your devices. Once again, please.
And I'll promise to give shorter answers. I'm sorry on that last one, but it was. Go ahead, Val.
Senator, our next question will be from Kelsey Childish with WSET.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for doing this. So kind of going off of that, obviously we reached a new record for inflation yesterday. What do you think needs to be done to lower those prices and really help ease the burden off of America?
Well, on inflation, it is obviously hurting Americans all across the country, all across every economic level. Disproportionately for middle-class Americans, this is hitting them really, really hard. I do think we are going to need to see the Federal Reserve continue to ratchet up interest rates, which will start to drive down some of the supply. I am disappointed, for example, that we couldn't have done more on, for example, support for affordable childcare. One of the things that we have a problem with is we don't have enough folks in the labor force. We have not seen the return, particularly of women, into the labor force to pre-COVID levels. And part of the problem with that is because there's not available childcare. A lot of the childcare centers that were set up before COVID have not reopened. I don't think we're going to, I don't see the appetite, unfortunately, but if you wanted to really grapple with something we could do tomorrow on inflation, let's make more childcare affordable and accessible. Let's make more universal preschool affordable and accessible. That would allow more people to get back into the workforce. This is a supply and demand issue. The Federal Reserve action, work around childcare. I do think we're starting to see, I hope at least, we've seen gas prices peak, and I think we're starting to see them slightly decline. I think the president in his current trip to the Middle East. If we can see some of these Middle Eastern regimes, not all of them necessarily folks that we're totally supportive, but we need to see them, those Middle Eastern countries, try to ratchet up their production of oil to try to overall bring down some of the oil prices, which translates through not directly dollar for dollar into lower gas prices. But we also have to acknowledge, and one of the things I hope we don't retreat from, and while inflation is high here, it is even higher in certain countries in Europe. I saw gas. I was on an Intel trip recently to Finland, and I think gas was over $9 a gallon in Finland. A lot of that is due to the activities of Putin's war in Ukraine. And my hope and prayer is I think Americans will stand strong, but I do hope our European friends will stand strong in terms of their support of the Ukrainians, because if Putin is allowed to somehow view his brutal invasion of Ukraine as some level of success because the Europeans get weak-kneed on their own inflationary activities, that could be a long-term national security disaster.
Senator, our next question will be Joe Dashiell with WDBJ.
Hello, Senator. I'd like to ask you a question about the federal response to the flooding in Southwest Virginia. You referred to this in your opening comments, but in light of FEMA's denial of the request for individual assistance following the flooding in Hurley, do you hope things will be different this time around, and what will you be doing to make sure the people of Buchanan County receive all the help they need this time?
The people of Buchanan County and the people of Southwest Virginia have got my commitment that I'll get on the line with, from the White House to the head of FEMA to the regional administrator. I have pointed out after what happened in Hurley a year ago, I think the system is biased against rural communities. I think there's a much greater chance in the event of this disaster, because unfortunately, and I again talked to the governor about this yesterday, the flooding this time is much more extensive. I believe over 800 homes. I think there's we talked about a couple of the businesses that have been hit. We're going to make a united front, the governor and I and the balance of the congressional delegation. If we got to drag these FEMA people physically to Buchanan County to have them do at the higher levels a review. Right now we're still in search and rescue mode. We're still making sure we've gone, as I said, from 40 people lost or unidentified to 3 this morning. That's good progress. But in these coming days, I've asked the governor, please get us that. The governor has to make the request. Get us that data as quickly as possible so that we can go into high gear to get this relief. I think we're going to be successful this time, but it does beg the bigger question, which I still think we need a review of the FEMA funding process so that these smaller communities, it may be 50 or 100 people hurt or displaced, you don't hit that dollar threshold number, that's a bias against rural community. Those families are just as well affected as if you're in a major city and it's not affecting people as much, but the aggregate dollar amount is higher. It just seems unfair to me. The unfortunate circumstance here, though, that may play to the benefit of Buchanan County is this damage is much broader and more devastating, at least in terms of number of individuals and businesses affected, than what happened in Hurley a year ago. So I think we will be successful at getting FEMA support.
Our next question will be Gene Moreno with WFIR.
Hi, Senator. I wonder if I can go a little far afield on something else to do with the gun issue. New York, I guess, just put a law in effect that social media posts will be considered as part of the application process for someone who wants to get a gun in New York. Why can't we do this at the federal level? I believe there was some opposition when it was brought up, but is this something that you think maybe could happen at the federal level where, social media posts have to be taken into account before you can buy a weapon?
I think that is a great question, and I want to look. I'm not familiar with the New York law, but or the proposal, but the idea that the kind of warning signals that appear on social media. We saw some of that with the shooter in Highland Park. We've seen it with some of the other shooters. Some of you may recall the racist, violent diatribe from the young guy who went and shot so many folks at the Walmart down in El Paso a couple years back. I mean, this was shouting literally from social media that this guy was going to go out and do damage. So how we go about this, I'll look at New York, but my belief is, and I'm talking to some of my Republican friends on this, and I think we have some opportunity. There is an existing law right now, something that came out of a 1996 bill, and that reformed telecommunications back there when these social media companies were not in existence, that was called Section 230, that basically gave them immunity from anything that was posted on their platforms. So as much as Facebook or Google or YouTube or others say, oh, we're trying to monitor, they have no incentive really, because they have no liability. Section 230 is a get out of jail free card for any of these companies to have any kind of responsibility to monitor the kind of content that could even lead to criminal behavior. So I'm looking at a very, very narrow change to Section 230 that says if you are in the physical world creating a level of harassment that could lead to a terror event or could lead to the kind of harassment that you could be sued under because I'm physically harassing you or verbally harassing you in the real world, well, that same kind of standard should be potentially applied in the virtual world in social media. It wouldn't be because it just makes no sense to me that in our physical world, there are certain things that are illegal, but if you do them in the virtual world, there's no penalty. And the guardians of these social media platforms, the Facebooks, or for that matter, some of these right-wing groups, the Parler, the Truth Social, some of these other groups that are propping up, that they have no responsibility at all. So I think this is an avenue, and it's not going to fix everything. Let me be clear. It's not going to solve every one of these heinous acts, but it sure as heck ought to be a step forward. And I'll take a look at what New York is proposing, but I think the key is Section 230 reform. I've got legislation on this. I'm willing to narrow my legislation just to these issues around activities that could be leading towards violent acts, that could be leading to these awful shootings. I think it may be an avenue that we've not fully pursued, and at least so far, I've got a number of my Republican friends who may not be willing to go further on traditional gun safety, and I would go further on traditional gun safety, but might be an avenue that could at least spot some of these mentally ill, violent, usually young men, and put a little more responsibility on the social media platforms to do a better job of policing. This would be exactly the kind of activity that could fit with some of the so-called red flag laws. If you've got these warning signals out there and nobody's taking these warning signals and then acting on them, shame on all of us.
Our next question will be Danielle Sandler with WVNS. Danielle.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, Senator.
Hi.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, perfect. So this is regarding the Dobbs v. Jackson. I just wanted to know what the repercussions was, what your thoughts would be on the repercussions if a woman decided to leave state to go get an abortion performed, and if it bless you, and if there's any impact that this will have on foster care as well.
Well, first of all, and maybe you missed my opening comments, I am a co-sponsor of legislation, and I believe it's called the Freedom to Travel Act, that would put a federal law in place that says a state that has restricted reproductive health care choices by women, a state that bans abortion, could not put a travel restriction in place that would prohibit that woman from crossing a state line to get medical services that are still available in another state. We still have those services available in Virginia. I think the vast majority of Virginians want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. And I hope and pray that we don't see the kind of restrictions that some in the legislature have talked about putting in place in Virginia. So I hope we could move that federal legislation that would say, once again, take a state that's so over the top like Texas that says not only are we going to prohibit you from having an abortion if you're a woman, but we're going to actually incent your neighbors to turn you into the police if it looks like you're trying to seek out that kind of medical care. So we are trying to put legislation for, it's called the Freedom to Travel Act, number one. In terms of the question about foster care, I've not seen any particulars on how the Dobbs decision might affect foster care. I'll try to do a little research there. I do know this. I think the outrageousness of these laws, of this decision, is playing out real time right now when you see this outrageous case of a 10-year-old girl raped in Ohio, not able to get health care services in Ohio, who had to try to be transported over to Indiana to be able to get the health care services she needs and she deserves. I think we're a better country than that. And that's why we need this freedom to travel legislation. That's why we need to make sure that people think long and hard as they choose their elected representatives this year and next year and 2024. Virginians, Americans get to decide whether we want this kind of Dobbs restriction on women's rights to stand, or whether we want to try to pass laws to protect and preserve women's health care choices.
Our next question will be Randy Hagee. We're going to move on to Randy Hagee with WMRA News.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for your time today. I also had a question about the Freedom to Travel Act. I was just curious if there is any precedent for federal law being needed to protect the right of a U.S. citizen to cross state lines.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the idea that I went to law school, but I never claimed to be a lawyer. But I do remember enough of the law school and the Constitution. You've got this right called interstate commerce, and under that notion of interstate commerce, there's a whole lot of things that have been allowed to have some federal protections because you assume you have that right to move from one location to another in America. It's one of the things that says, well, we got 50 states, we are still one nation under God, and that fact that we're that nation gives you the right of free ability to move. The idea, and it just seems, frankly, downright un-American to me, that some state that says, we are so want to dictate what women do with their bodies or what women choose to do for their health care decisions, to say, not only are we going to make it illegal for you to get access to health care in Texas or in Alabama, but we're going to try to say to you, you can't even go to another state and get those health care opportunities. Again, I would never trust me on my legal opinions, But it sure as heck sounds to me like that's about as, that sounds to me a little bit crazy. And this Freedom to Travel Act, I hope we could get it passed. I think the vast majority of Americans, again, I think even those Americans, those Virginians who feel, well, that they have, legitimate concerns about post-viability, second-term abortions. I just can't believe that the vast majority of them would say, well, no, we want that 10-year-old girl who was raped in Ohio not to be able to get a health care service, and we're going to somehow prevent her from going to Indiana. I would like to meet that person and have them explain what they're thinking.
Our next question will be Mitch Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us. My question fuses together some of the issues you've already touched on with the China competitiveness legislation and inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Given your colleague Senator Manchin's concern about inflation and issues with the GOP involving the competitiveness bill, is there still a path for Senate Democrats getting a vote on budget reconciliation this month? And what do you think the consequences are if that doesn't happen?
Well, great question, Mitchell. First of all, I do think even Senator McConnell has indicated that he gets the fact that there are national security concerns if we don't invest in the chips, in the 5G and open radio access network. Some of you may recall the company Huawei, and that has a whole set of telecom, that we ought to have the investment tax credit. We need to make sure that we are building these chip facilities and we control the whole supply chain for semiconductor chips, and we have a domestic source for that. I think I'm actually much more optimistic. I think that will get done. On the question around reconciliation, I've been around this track a bunch of times. I should have, frankly, added on my earlier answer on inflation, the one piece, and I know Joe Manchin is very supportive of this, we ought to go ahead and have America join the rest of industrial nations in the world and allow Medicare, our largest purchaser of drugs, to negotiate prices. Every other country does that. That will save roughly $270 billion, which could potentially be invested in child care or potentially be invested in bringing down health care costs. But it will have an immediate effect as it's rolled out on inflation because it will help bring down the prices of drugs. So that piece, I'd like to do more, but politics is the art of possible. Politics, especially these days in D.C., is the art of possible. I hope Senator Manchin, who's a friend, if we can do more than that, but let's at least get this drug pricing piece put together because it's just not fair, because the circumstance right now is Americans pay for the research and development for drugs for the whole world. I was a venture capital guy. I believe, and I know how important it is to do R&D, but there ought to be a system that says those R&D costs ought to be shared around the industrial world at least, and not have Americans pick up the full tab. Because what happens is the drug companies make so much money off of the price gouging that takes place in America, and then when they sell the same drug in Canada or France or Britain or Japan, they have to lower the cost dramatically because those countries negotiate. This is long overdue, and I hope we take advantage of getting this done sooner than later.
Our next question will be Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our question.
Thanks, Amy.
It's the middle of July, but I'm already hearing from Virginians who heat with oil. They're expressing concern over how they're going to keep their houses warm this winter. They're worried about historically high prices when it already costs a few $1,000s for a typical season. Are there any plans or conversations at the state or federal level for families that don't typically meet the qualifications for fuel assistance, but also can't afford the potential price hike?
Amy, you've probably, good question, because there was a chart in one of the papers today that showed category by category, where the biggest inflation was. Home heating oil was the highest increase in prices. I think it was like 98% increase, almost 100 doubling of prices since last year at this time. Again, we've seen, if you look at the national price for oil and national and international pricing for oil, that's started to drop a little bit. I think the president's trying to get, countries in the Middle East to increase their production capabilities. They have held back, and I think we need to remind them that they have a responsibility to the global economy. And frankly, a lot of these countries buy military equipment from the U.S. We help them. They need to step up as well. But I am very open, Amy. If this kind of increase continues into the fall, at re-examining some of the fuel assistance programs to maybe kind of ratchet up on the income levels so that more middle class folks could get some of this assistance. We in Virginia have a relatively small percentage of our fellow Virginians who are heat their homes or businesses with home heating oil. But boy, oh boy, you get into New England, and it is extraordinary amount. It is one of the reasons why as well, though, and part of it, I should stop there, but part of this as well means, some of that home heating oil could be replaced with natural gas, and we've got plenty of natural gas in this country. We've simply been unable to get, candidly, a pipeline finished to New England that could provide some relief. Again, that's not Virginians. That's states where 30, 40, 50% of the folks rely on home heating oil. I think that's part of the solution. But in terms of your specific question, yes, I am open to raising the income standards for folks to get assistance on home heating oil, particularly if these costs stay at this astronomical level as we get into the winter.
Senator, our last question today will be from Joe Thomas with WCHB.
This is becoming a habit where I'm the last question.
I don't know, Joe. I don't know what. I don't know. I think Joe. Val. I think next time Joe gets to go first. I think it's not fair that Joe. Because Joe always has one of the more provocative questions. So, and for those of you, because I sometimes go long on Joe's questions, so maybe that's why. But I'm sorry. I'll hush and Joe, go ahead.
All right. I wanted to follow up on something you said in our last press briefing, but just yesterday I saw a video where Senator Hawley mentioned you during testimony regarding the bills being investigated into protecting abortion access, regarding a letter that he said you sent to Google regarding censoring or changing search results regarding crisis pregnancy centers. If you could mention that, if you heard about it, I don't know if you saw the testimony or not, but last time you did mention that your latest gang, the gang looking into the Electoral College Act, might have something in July. Do you have anything on that since we're here now?
Great. Thank you for both questions, Joe. Let me take them. I'll give you two different bites so you can, on the Electoral Count Act, we met last night. We are 98% of the way done. We're simply trying to finish some technical language. My hope is we'll see legislation that will be introduced next week. It will clarify, for example, the role that in any future presidential election, that the vice president's role is only ministerial, that there is no ability for the vice president to throw out the legitimate results of states' voting returns. It will also put in place a clearer process so that if any future presidential candidate feels that they have not been treated fairly or that there's been election fraud, there is a clearer process on how you seek remedies. It is not going to deal with a host of other voting right concerns that I have. It is narrow, but it is bipartisan, and I hope and pray that the Senate will move on it quickly and pass it so we can show that to the American public that at least we've made some progress on where there was some, I don't think a lot of lack of clarity, but there was clearly some folks who felt that the vice president had abilities to throw out legitimate votes. This vice president, or the past vice president, Mike Pence, luckily stood for law and order and the Constitution, but let's make sure there's no ambiguity there. On the other issue, you're right, Senator Hawley and I have big disagreement. This is again goes a lot to the questions of our social media companies that have very little responsibility. What Google was doing is, if you are looking for abortion services and you Google that, what Google was doing was, and I said, and oftentimes putting in place crisis pregnancy centers that did not offer abortion services. That, and these crisis pregnancy centers have a right to exist. They try to counsel people not to have abortions. That is a service, and for some folks, a service that they would want. But to me, it appears a bit deceptive that if you are clear in your question that you're looking for a legal, medically sanctioned location where you can obtain an abortion, and if that abortion is legal in that state, you should get those kind of facilities, not a set of facilities that their main goal is to prevent you from having an abortion. I mean, it's just, let's take it out of the abortion realm, which is so fiery hot. If I'm, looking for a restaurants that only serve Chinese food, and there's a bunch of restaurants that want to misadvertise, and they say, to get myself into an example here I probably shouldn't head into, an example here that says we've got the best dim sum in the world, but then they all only offer French crepes. That seems to be a deceptive practice. So that's what I and others wrote Google on. I think there needs to be a bit of truth in advertising here, and I think we're still awaiting an answer.
And Senator, that was
all right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Well, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. I do think, again, on the CHIPS piece, I think we will see action. On the Electoral Count Act, I think we will see action. Hope everybody's having a good summer. And again, to the folks in Southwest Virginia and Buchanan County, we're going to get you that federal aid. You deserve it. This is a tragedy that where our country needs to step up and stand by you in your time of need. Thanks, everybody.